I oppose the amendment. This legislation that we have before us is based on the Fairness for High School Immigrants Act, which was co-sponsored by over 100 of our Republican colleagues, some of whom sit on this committee. As we know, the bill was then modified to add a longer transition period for certain employment-based categories, as well as the additional H-1B transparency and accountability provisions. That was carefully drafted to include provisions that make modest but meaningful changes to our immigration system. The transition period for the employment-based provisions, EB 2 and 3, are important so that individuals from other countries who have expressed concern that they might be disadvantaged are not. The fourth preference employment-based immigrant visa category is a very broad category that encompasses 11 different groups. They include special immigrant juveniles. Now, special immigrant juveniles, a lot of people don't know what that is. If you have been abandoned by a parent, you can go into state court and a judge will make a determination whether in fact your parent has abandoned you, and if so, you are eligible for special immigrant juvenile status. I will note that with that status comes a prohibition on ever petitioning for the parent who's abandoned you, but it's really to take care of abandoned children because they're subject to the 3 and to the per country cap. We have this whole cohort that a judge has determined has been abandoned by their parent, and yet there's a backlog and these abandoned children are in limbo. That is not, and honestly, the SIJ visa was stuck into fourth preference without a lot of thought. It doesn't, you could argue it doesn't belong in there at all, but that's where it is. We have not had any input from the religious community that also has religious workers in this category, and I have been a huge advocate for the religious worker program in past Congresses and remain so, but we have not had that kind of input from our faith-based community. I think this is would have placed hardship, additional hardship on these juveniles who've been abandoned. I don't think that's good policy, and I don't want, therefore, to put them into this transition period because this bill provides a solution for these kids. And as we know, most, I don't want to say all of these kids, but a very large number of these children who've been abandoned come from the 3 countries in Central America. And so the per country cap and the limitation is jamming them up. And I just don't think that's the kind of system. We never envisioned it, really. When we wrote the special immigrant juvenile provisions, nobody ever assumed that we would have these young people adjudicated abandoned who would then be in some long limbo. That's not a good policy position to land at, and the bill does resolve that problem. I think we should stick with what's in the bill, and the amendment would unwind it, and therefore I would urge that we not support the amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question occurs on the amendment.
On the amendment.
All in favor say aye. Opposed, no?
No.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments? For what purposes, Mr. Tiffany seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will
I
report the
reserve
amendment.
a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3648, offered by Mr. Tiffany of Wisconsin.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would simply put some teeth behind an existing law that directs the executive branch to halt the issuance of visas in what are known as recalcitrant countries. These are countries which refuse to allow us to repatriate their criminal aliens, which leaves thousands of criminal aliens from those countries here in the United States. Due to legal precedents that prevent us from detaining these individuals indefinitely, this can result in situations where foreign criminals who should have been removed from our country released into unsuspecting communities. China is perhaps the world's largest offender in this regard. Foreign governments in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East have also been uncooperative, and many others are classified as being at risk of noncompliance. The principle behind my amendment is a very simple one. If a foreign government refuses the repatriation of their own citizens, why would we want to bring more of them here, knowing we may never be able to remove them? If these countries wish to get off the naughty list, all they must do is cooperate with us and take back their own criminals instead of using the United States as a dumping ground for foreign scofflaws. And just to give you an example, remember the Mariel boat lift from Cuba back in about 1980 when we had thousands of people that came across the water to Florida, and Fidel Castro emptied his prisons. And we have something kind of like that right now, a Mariel boat lift, only they're going across the Rio Grande. If you read the stories this week, they're selling their homes in Havana and places like that in Cuba, hoping to be able to get here as the promise of Title 42 going away stands before the world. And the terrible public policy change that we're about to make here in the United States. And so I ask for a yes vote on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do not. It is a germane amendment, but I would like to strike the last one.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I think this is an amendment that we should not adopt, and I'll tell you why. There are countries that from time to time have refused to accept their nationals who are being removed from the United States. And that's infuriating, and the gentleman is correct. There is a U.S. Supreme Court decision indicating that you cannot indefinitely hold people in custody, the Zadias case, if their home country won't accept them. That's problematic, and there are ways to press these sort of scofflaw nations into acting. But I think the H-1B visa prohibition actually is an incentive for countries to be recalcitrant. Because here's what's happening in these countries. People who are graduating from the best research universities they have to offer are then leaving. It's a brain drain from these countries. They're coming to the United States, and the H-1B visa is one of the few where Congress has provided what's called dual intent, so that unlike a visitor's visa or a student visa, where you have to prove to the visa issuer that you have an intent to return to your home country, for the H-1B visa, you can have dual intent. You can have intent to come temporarily, but have a long-term goal of staying permanently to the United States. And most of the people who are in the EB 2 and 3 category are actually who are the recipients of visa petitions by their employers. Well over 90% are in the United States lawfully working. So this is a brain drain to some extent from some other countries, and it benefits the United States. Some of the most important technology developments in the United States have happened by individuals who are who've come either to study and then stay on H-1Bs and then as permanent residents. So I think the incentive is exactly opposite for the recalcitrant countries, and I do think that this is an issue that the committee has not talked about and I know the gentleman has raised this on another bill, and it might be something that we should discuss more seriously after this markup, because I do think, what is the pressure point if you've got a bad actor country that won't accept people are being removed? Probably their diplomats and their diplomatic staff denying visas to the offspring of totalitarian leaders. That will get to them, not denying H-1B visas to geniuses who want to come and build companies in the United States. So I urge that we do not approve this amendment, but I will look forward to working with Mr. Tiffany at a later date on what we might craft, with the help, I think, of the Foreign Affairs Committee, because they have a piece of that jurisdiction as well that might actually work as an incentive for these recalcitrant nations. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Chip, will you yield me? Okay, Dan's got it.
Who seeks recognition?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Bishop,
For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
to strike the last word on the,
Gentleman is recognized.
and I yield my time to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. So, first of all, today we created a loophole for the Virgin Islands, which we're going to drive a whole bunch more people through. We saw it in the Mariana Islands, and now we're going to create one closer to home here in the Virgin Islands. And now we heard the quote just now. I know this is infuriating, and there's ways in which we can press this issue, and we can discuss this more seriously in the future. I've got an amendment here at the table that can address this problem. And there are a few different ways, as a gentle lady from California said, that we can press this issue for other countries. Why not put another tool in the toolbox? Why not have another way here to deal with these recalcitrant countries? And this amendment comes to you in good faith. And once again, we're being told, let's get this bill done, and I give you a promise of the future. It kind of sounds like budgeting here in the capital of Washington, D.C., doesn't it? Isn't that how the promise always goes?
I would submit to the gentleman that it sounds like immigration law for the past 40 years, as illustrated by the discussion, the exchange of comments between me and the gentlelady from Texas. There have been constant amnesties followed that were connected to promises of security and security provisions, and those never come to pass. Security's never done. It's another amnesty, it's another liberalization without those things being done.
Would the gentleman yield?
Let me yield back to the gentleman from Wisconsin because I interrupted his point.
And I suspect that the gentle lady from California thinks she's making a legitimate offer here, but it really rings hollow when we've seen this time after time. I mean, this is kind of Charlie Brown and Lucy, where the football gets pulled away every time. And forgive me if I'm jaded in regards to this, and I know you always address these things with us in a soft-spoken manner and with a sound of sincerity, but sincerity comes with actions. And we have not seen those actions be sincere. I yield back to the gentleman from North Carolina.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will momentarily, but I must say before doing that, it seems to me, and I understood the gentlelady from California's point about that you might actually deter countries who want to be recalcitrant from letting people come here because it'd be a brain drain. Therefore, we need to sort of figure out how to work around them. It does seem to me to be most reasonable to expect this program to work well for the United States with countries with whom we have a good relationship. And if you have a country that's a scofflaw, I would rather start with the presumption that that's not a good country to work with. And with that, I'll yield to the gentlelady from California.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Let me be clear. I don't think this amendment is an effective measure for the problem that's been identified. So I'm happy not to work with Mr. Tiffany in the future on this, but I just think this is not going to solve the problem that he has identified, and perhaps I wasn't as clear about that as I should have been. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time, I yield to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Well, unfortunately, we heard it. We heard it just now. I'm happy not to work with you, Congressman Tiffany. And sitting in the majority, authoring many of these resolutions, I would expect some magnanimity where you would say, okay, I am genuine, that I do want to work with you.
Would the
But what I
gentleman
hear is
yield?
that we're happy not to work with you. I yield back to the gentleman.
If the gentleman would yield, I just want to be clear. My offer to work was sincere. My sincerity was questioned. So I don't want to impose upon the gentleman, and I wanted to make that clear. I yield back.
The time of the gentleman has expired. For what purposes does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Some of us, like Ms. Loughran, have been working on the H-1B fix, if you will, for a good while, and I want to applaud. I'm glad there are many of us who are co-sponsor of this legislation because there have been a great improvement, and it does respond to the enormity of the backlog and the dissatisfaction, frankly, between H-1B holders, H-1B persons like the individual that Ms. Ross cited who had to be deported back to their country, the loss of talent. So I'd like to just emphasize, Mr. Chairman, some of the positive nuances that I think have been included in this legislation. For example, the Department of Labor is directed to establish a searchable internet website for the posting of H-1B positions within 180 days, requiring employers to provide public notice of new H-1B positions on the newly established page. Online job postings must include the occupational classification, job title, education, experience requirements, salary or wage, benefits offered, location, and the employer's process for applying for a position, all to the extent of not taking advantage of the applicant. But in addition, prevailing wage requires employers to submit to the DOL documentation of methodology used to establish a prevailing wage for a prospective H-1B employee. As relates to American workers who sometimes have thought that the H-1B holders would be in place of them. Advertising for the position must not state that the position is only open to H-1B workers or that H-1B workers will be given preference. The employer has not primarily recruited H-1B workers for the position. The employer agrees to submit forms W-2 filed on behalf of H-1B employees if requested by DOL. Another aspect that sometimes have proven difficult. The ending of foreign media abuse prohibits individuals who are classifiable as representative of the foreign press, radio, film, or other foreign information media, and who are seeking entry into the United States for that purpose from receiving an H-1B visa or being admitted into the United States. In the backdrop of our constant nemesis in Russia and all the efforts that it has made to interfere with our presidential elections and other aspects of our quality of life, I think this is an important aspect that is a nuance to this particular legislation. In addition, it expands whistleblower protection to preclude employers from taking, failing to take, or threatening to take or fail or take a personnel action against a whistleblower. So it goes on in other aspects of it, specifies that an employer who violates a whistleblower protection shall be liable to an employee for lost wages and benefits. It requires USCIS to share with DOL information submitted by employers in H-1B petitions that indicates the employer is not complying with H-1B program requirements. So there are aspects of this legislation that cross the T's and dot the I's of some of the elements that I think make the actions more more honest, if you will, by employers, and also to work with the Department of Labor and to protect certain elements, including a whistleblower, saying to the American worker that H-1B is not given preference, and then taking care of the enormity of the backlog, which I think has been so serious over decades. And so I'm asking my colleagues, Republicans, to join in a constructive response to H-1B, to capture talent, to protect American workers, to protect whistleblowers, and to ensure that taxes are paid and the H-1B program works well. With that,
Would the
I'm happy to
gentlelady-
yield to the gentlelady.
I thank her for her comments. I would just note on the point that she's made on the backlog, the Congressional Research Service did an analysis of wait times, and they say, the CRS says that the estimated wait time for EB-2 green card in fiscal year 2021 for applicants born in India, this is from CRS, is 214.4 years. That's how long you will wait to get your visa number. Obviously, you will be dead before that happens. So when I hear people say, get in line, well, people in line are going to be dead before the visa number comes up. And
Time of the gentlelady has expired.
Their children old.
Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question occurs on the bill, on the amendment. On the amendment, all in favor say aye. Opposed, no? No? In the opinion of in the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
no,
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee. Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass. Ms. Bass.
Bass votes no.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries.
Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline.
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu.
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings.
No.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
Scanlon votes no.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
Dean votes no.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones.
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat.
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Issa.
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Aye.
Mr. Johnston of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stube? Mr. Tiffany?
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach?
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz?
Benz votes aye.
Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Owens?
Are there any members who wish to vote who haven't voted yet? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 14 ayes and 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After the, on page 16 of the bill is a subdivision titled Ending Media Abuse of H-1B, and immediately after that, on page 17, line 2, after line 2, I propose to an addition to also end the abuse of the program by the Chinese Communist Party. In 2020, the New York Post columnist Sohrab Ahmari wrote detailing how Facebook was using Chinese nationals holding H-1B visas to help censor content from its users. He reported that there were at least half dozen Chinese nationals who are working on censorship for the hate speech engineering team at Facebook. One of the staffers was a research scientist who earned his master's degree in computer engineering from the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. Another earned his bachelor's and master's degree in computer science from Jilin University in Northeast China. Another engineer previously worked for the communist-backed conglomerate Huawei. How in the world did it come to pass that we're using the H-1B program, or allowing the H-1B program's use by the CCP or by CCP-tied individuals taking advantage of non-immigrant visas in order to censor content on Facebook? But that's, let's see, let me also momentarily seek, I'd like to seek unanimous consent to submit that column for the record, Meet Your Chinese Facebook Censors, in the New York Post.
Without objection.
But that's not all. Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee investigation revealed that non-immigrant visas, including H-1Bs, are being used for China's Thousand Talents program. The State Department conducted a review, said its review process leads to less than 5% of reviewed applicants being denied a visa, nor do states systematically track visa applicants linked to China's talent recruitment plans. And so, question again, why are we allowing the use of the H-1B program to allow CCP-affiliated individuals to come to the U.S. to recruit and buy off U.S. persons on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party? In 2008, the Chinese government announced its plan to recruit top overseas researchers and to eventually bring their talents and expertise to China to benefit the government. It took the FBI 10 years to recognize that the Chinese government talent programs posed a threat to the U.S. academic community and federal research grants. In 2015, the FBI identified the Chinese talent plans as a known vector of a non-traditional threat. They used the H-1B program. Former Representative Mike Rogers wrote a column in The Hill that the CCP had infiltrated nearly every aspect of our society. He cited the Thousand Talents program, recruiting U.S. professors, researchers, and scientists to share documents and knowledge with the CCP in exchange for cash. We all know about Fang Fang. The American Spectator, between 2014 and 2019, Chinese state-owned entities donated at least $315 million to U.S. universities, including $88 million coming from Chinese contractors and universities that assist the Chinese military and defense research. There are several details there. 200 CCP-affiliated donors gave to dozens of American universities, but some of those colleges and universities did not disclose those donations. Columbia University accepted $1 million to set up a Confucius Institute. University of California, Irvine, and Northwestern University accepted a combined $4 million donation for research from a company controlled by a Chinese defense contractor that reverse engineered Chinese military planes from stolen F-35 designs. Michigan accepted a $1.3 million donation from Harbin University, China's MIT, which the Treasury Department had put on its ban list. So I'll also ask unanimous consent to submit those 3 articles that I made reference to, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Bottom line, it seems to me to be almost beyond arguing that it makes sense, as this program is being amended, to provide, as this amendment does, that it may not be used to issue a visa to an alien who is affiliated with or is a member of the Chinese Communist Party, and that the Secretary of Homeland Security may not admit such an alien pursuant to these provisions. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do not insist on the point of order. It is germane, but I would like to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I strike the last word in opposition to this amendment, and let me tell you why. First, the amendment is unnecessary and falls short of the more nuanced provisions of law that exist in the Immigration and Nationality Act. If you take a look at Section 212, excludable aliens, people are not eligible for admission if they have been a member of or affiliated, this is in 212D, 3CD, with the communist or any other totalitarian party, domestic or foreign. You're inadmissible. Except there's an exception for involuntary membership. The clause of excluding Communist Party individuals shall not apply to an alien because of membership or affiliation if the alien establishes to the satisfaction of the consular officer when applying for a visa or to the AG when applying for admission that the membership or affiliation is or was involuntary or is or was solely when under the age of 16 years of age by operation of law or for the purposes of obtaining employment, food rations, or other essentials of living, and whether necessary for such purposes. So basically, the law does what the gentleman's amendment purports to do, but it makes sure that if you were a conscript or you were forced, there's an exception for that. And I think that is important.
Would the gentlelady repeat her citation, please?
Yes, it's 212(3)D. A3D. There is value to the United States in getting very smart people from all over the world into our universities and into our business establishment. The Bipartisan National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence has stated that the best way to counter China is to attract their best and brightest talent to the United States. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party sees brain drain as a very serious national security threat to them. And our ability to attract and retain talent is an obstacle to their ambitions. I think this amendment, since there is a phenomena in China where individuals are involuntarily made members of the Communist Party, they would be treated as if they were full-fledged communist believers. So I don't think, I'm guessing, that there's disagreement. Really, we don't want people who are at odds with us, people who are our adversaries, to be admitted. The gentleman doesn't want that, and I don't want that. But I think the nuanced provision in the law, which provides for exceptions for people who were children or who were forced in some way, is better than the amendment which he has offered. And in terms of productivity and innovation for the U.S., the smartest people getting here and becoming Americans is an important strength of the United States of America. So I would urge opposition.
Would the gentleman lady yield?
Let me finish. I would urge opposition to this amendment as redundant, except and unnecessary, and not quite as nuanced as the existing law. And yes, I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman.
I think the gentlelady, and I'll try to squeeze this in, the gentlelady cited section 212A3D. And if my expert advice from behind the dais is correct, 212A3D of the INA only applies to immigrants, not non-immigrants. And H-1B visa holders are non-immigrants. So in fact, what that points up is, I think you have a gaping hole that needs to be fixed by this amendment, no?
No, I don't believe so, because if you go back to it talks about his admission, if you go to the very first paragraph in section 212, entitled Excludable Aliens, it's 8 U.S. Code 1182. Classes of aliens ineligible for visas or admission, and
The
it's
time of the
not
gentleman
limited.
has expired.
Mr.
That
Chairman,
was my time, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry, the time of the gentlelady has expired. For what purpose does Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
move strike last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in support of the gentleman from North Carolina's amendment. As I mentioned in my earlier statement in opposition to the underlying legislation, my biggest issue with this legislation is that it invites individuals sent by the Chinese Communist Party to infiltrate our society and ultimately receive a green card. Mr. Bishop's amendment would help curb that possibility. By precluding members of the Chinese Communist Party from attaining an H-1B visa, we would greatly reduce the potential for China's subverting our government and ultimately doing harm to the American public or to American businesses. The Trump administration limited visa access for CCP, Chinese Communist Party journalists. Why shouldn't we do the same for H-1B visa applicants from the CCP? It's my understanding that 2 H-1B visas have been used as an alternative to the I visa, the journalism visa, because it can be renewed every 3 years, presumably with the future possibility that the worker will be sponsored for a green card. Now, I happen to be the former chairman and current ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. And China is, the name of the subcommittee suggests, they fall squarely within our jurisdiction. And China is doing everything in its power to weaken the United States. It's stealing our intellectual property. It's working with the Russians in attempting to destroy Ukraine. And it's sending members of the Chinese Communist Party into the United States to spy and otherwise infiltrate our government. We know that's happening. China is our principal rival, our adversary, whether we want to admit it or not. And we have tried, we thought that by trading with them and allowing them into WTO and giving them what used to be called most favored nations, which then became normal trade relations. Essentially what we did, we thought they'd become more like us if they were able to work with us and trade with us and invest here and we invest there. But just the opposite has happened. Their behavior has been abhorrent. And now, as we all know, they're working with Vladimir Putin to undermine and to try to take over Ukraine. And a lot of innocent people are dying there. So Mr. Bishop, his amendment is a good amendment. It's really a necessary amendment and ought to be supported by anyone who takes the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, the PRC, People's Republic of China, seriously. And I hope that there'll be some bipartisan support here, because I know both sides at least act like they think Chinese Communist Party is a threat. Let's look at this vote and how it goes and see if it's true or not. And I yield back.
I need some time.
The gentleman yields back. For our purposes, Mr. Royce recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
I would just note, this was a similar debate that we had earlier with respect to the U.S. Virgin Islands provision. I'd share the interpretation of both our counsel and Mr. Bishop, and do support Mr. Bishop's effort to amend, and it would yield to him.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I think this is, first of all, the committee's not in order. Mr. Chairman, the committee's not in order. Great, thank you, Madam Chairman. And to the point, the discussion that we were having, I've been in the interim looking at INA Section 212, codified at Title 8, 1182 of the United States Code. And it is headed Classes of Aliens Ineligible for Visas or Admission. It's very interesting. If you go through each of these subsections, 1, 2, 3, etc., each of the categories begins any alien. So the exclusions are any alien under 1, health-related grounds. Under 2, criminal and related grounds. I'm trying to find the appropriate introductory language there. Let me just keep going. Security and related grounds. Any alien who's a consular officer, terrorist activities, any alien. These exclusions are applying to any alien in every case. But when you get over to 3D, it suddenly changes to any immigrant who is or has been a member of or affiliated with the communist or any other totalitarian party or subdivision or affiliate thereof, or domestic or foreign, is inadmissible. A couple points. One observation is it doesn't specify the Chinese Communist Party. It specifies a communist party. In case the Democratic Party is not yet aware of what Donald Trump made the whole world aware, the Chinese Communist Party is the preeminent threat in the world to the United States. So that is point enough to warrant a separate provision, even if redundant. And here, I think the advice given by staff counsel is exactly right. The language is jarringly different. It isn't covering every alien category, it's covering immigrants. And this is a non-immigrant visa. So I can't understand, in fact, staff, I think, is back there having a disagreement about it, or discussing their way through the language, as I've just attempted to do as a newcomer to it. But it's sufficiently obvious that there's an omission there, there's a difference in categorization, that it makes no sense not to cover the Chinese Communist. If we can take care of a media abuse, can we not take care of abuses by the Chinese Communist Party? Can my Democrats majority not join me in doing that? And with that, I yield the time back to Mr. Roy.
And I would just echo that this was related to the exchange we had earlier, right, on the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I was making the point, not as eloquently as the gentleman from North Carolina, and share the exact same concern and interpretation of our counsel, and look at it and that distinction where it says immigrant as opposed to the other sections. And I think clarifying it, both in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which I think we agreed to have a conversation about, and then I think the gentleman here is making the same point, and I agree with him, but I'll yield to the gentlelady.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I believe, I understand the point you're making. I think as applied, this section has always applied to aliens seeking admission as well as people seeking immigrant visas. We You know, it's been a long time since I taught immigration law, but we will do further research on this subsequent to this bill. I think we will reach out to our Department of Homeland Security career people and see whether my understanding is correct or not correct, and if so, we'll have ample opportunity to make corrections.
Reclaiming my time, yielding to the gentleman from North Carolina.
I thank the gentle lady, but if we're going to mark up this bill, and as opposed to withdrawing it from the calendar, if we're going to mark up this bill, then let's take care of the abuse from the Chinese Communist Party.
If I may, if the gentleman
Yielding
would
to
further yield,
the chair.
the point of the existing statute, which is there are exceptions for people who have been coerced or who were involuntarily entered as children. I think that is important, and it is absent in the gentleman's amendment. Thank you for yielding.
I'm going to yield back
Yield
to
back,
me.
Chair. Yep.
I suggest that the greater problem is the Chinese Communist Party.
Co-sponsor. Yield back.
Time has expired. Are there, Mr. Biggs, are you seeking recognition? Where is he? Ah, there
I
you
am
are.
indeed.
Up there in a little box. You're recognized.
Yeah, yes, indeed, Madam Chair, thank you. You know, I too had,
Are you
Ryan, in
moving
front
to
of me.
strike the last word, or do you have an amendment, sir?
yes, moving to strike the last word, yes,
Okay, you're
thanks.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I too, like Mr. Bishop, had decided to pull out the immigration law handbook here to look at his amendment. And he's right. I think he's right 100%. And I can't say it any better than he has, but I will ask a few questions. You might determine that they're rhetorical, but I would like an answer. I mean, because what we just heard was that, you know, even though the language is different in this section, as it refers to immigrant as opposed to an alien, that all the adjudicators routinely just treat them all the same. I don't know that I accept that, and it certainly would be sloppy on the part of adjudicators because you do have specific statutory language dealing with immigrants, which is why Rep. Bishop's amendment is so vital. But if they are treating them the same, I would be curious to know how many people have actually been rejected pursuant to this section here, this subsection here that Representative Bishop is referring to. Anybody know? My guess is nobody, which is why you need the amendment. So I stand firmly behind Representative Bishop. This amendment is absolutely critical. It's necessary I'm struggling to understand why if we're marking up a bill, why we keep saying, well, look, we're going to get to this. We'll address this in the future. We'll address this down the road. Well, now there's so many things that there's been commitments to address down the road. We probably ought to pull this bill, rework it, and see if we can come to some kind of consensus on this. But there's stuff that has to be fixed here. This is one of them.
Would the gentleman
And,
yield? Would the gentleman yield?
And with that, I'm going to yield.
the gentleman
back to the
yield?
chair.
Mr. Biggs, would you yield to me, please?
Yeah, I'll yield to the gentleman from North Carolina.
You know, I think the thing that's pretty remarkable about this, as I think about it, is not only that this bill comes to markup without this being dealt with, but the very same argument, I'm told, I don't think I was here, I was briefly away from the hearing, but Mr. Roy, in an amendment you raised in the previous bill, this exact issue was presented to the majority. And it took it coming up again and my doing a quick read through the statute and articulating the language even to give some pause to the majority. I can't imagine in the current circumstances that the United States faces and the geopolitical circumstances of the world that you would not seal off Chinese Communist Party's abuse of this program tighter than a drum. And I yield back to Mr. Biggs.
Did the gentleman
I thank the
yield?
gentleman. So if I can just continue on with my thematic for just a second longer. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. Now, what you need to understand about that is it is bigger than the entire population of the United States of America. And in China, if you're not a member of the Chinese Communist Party, you're virtually treated as a second-class citizen. You're out on the edge. This is a massive problem for us. because the Chinese Communist Party has been infiltrating and spying on us and stealing our technology, stealing our intellectual property, and views us not as an economic competitor, but as a Cold War type of adversary. I cannot believe that we're not addressing this and that the majority is stumbling over this. I think we need to address this. Tonight's the night to deal with it, or else pull the bill and let's come back tomorrow or next week or the weekend, whenever we're back in session, and let's resolve the issue. But I think this amendment is so timely, and it's necessary. I support it, and I yield back to my time.
For what purpose does Ms. Jackson Lee seek recognition?
Right Again Act, HR 1924. I was detained in another hearing and was not able to get back for the vote, and I would have voted resoundingly aye for Mr. Jeffries' Expunge Act. I'd like that placed in the record at the appropriate place.
Without objection.
I think I'm on a UC, am I?
Yes.
Thank you. Would have been happy to yield, but I'm on a UC.
The question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. In the opinion,
No.
in the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it.
I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass.
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries.
No.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline.
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu.
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings.
No.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
Scanlon votes no.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
Dean, no.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones.
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross. Ms. Bush. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat.
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Issa.
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates.
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs.
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey.
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach.
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz.
Yes.
Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens?
Mr. Chairman, this is Corey Bush. How am I recorded?
Ms. Bush, you are not recorded.
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Deutsch, you are not recorded.
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 14 ayes and 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on the amendment in nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in nature of a substitute is agreed to. Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 3648 is amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Opposed? Opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Deutsch?
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass?
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu?
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal?
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stimmings?
Aye.
Ms. Stimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Correa votes aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Scanlon votes aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Oh, okay.
Aye.
Okay.
Ms. Garcia votes aye.
Everybody, please remember to mute your microphone unless you're voting. Ms. Garcia?
I said aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath?
McBath votes aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross?
Aye. Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat?
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates?
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs?
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach?
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz?
No.
Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Owens?
Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Jeffries, you are not recorded.
Jeffries votes aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye.
Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Are there any other members who haven't been recorded who wish to be recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 22 ayes and 14 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is amended as ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all of our members for attending. Without objection, the markup is adjourned.